those that are unaware, the 3 Ps is a reference to a rivalry between 3 prestigious brands. Although there have been more than 30 brands that start with P, the 3 in question are Packard, Peerless, and Pierce. A rivalry that began with the early Glidden Tours, also known as the National Reliability Runs, promotional events created by AAA and named after the primary financier. Held from 1905 to 1913, these were early timed rally races that covered several hundred miles, with hundreds of entrants, many of which were unable to finish, let alone get a top score. An event that is also known to be the origin of the checkered flag, with event officials being called checkers. Both Pierce and Peerless received perfect scores in 1905, with Pierce taking home the trophy. The next 2 years, all 3 makes received perfect scores, creating a perfect rivalry among the Ps. And by 1910, all 3 brands were in direct competition in the prestige market. The Packard brothers started building cars in 1899, after James Packard suggested improvements to Winton, and was advised that if he thought he could build a better car himself, he should. So he did. They were soon selling some of the most expensive cars offered in both the U.S. and Europe. Peerless started building Didion-Bouton-powered cars under license in 1900, and building their own cars by 1902, an early front-engine rear-wheel drive design that would soon be the popular layout, and starting a line of Green Dragon race cars that would win races and set a number of speed records. The George N. Pierce Company dates back to 1865, with automobile production beginning in 1901, starting with the single-cylinder motorette, moving to the Arrow Twin in 1903, and then into the high-end luxury field with the Greater Arrow in 1904, which would edge out the other 2 companies in the final voting of the Glidden Tours. Packard had already introduced its classic cathedral window or ox yoke grille by 1904, and would soon expand into 61 countries. Peerless was also expanding rapidly thanks to its racing successes, and Pierce would be the first presidential limousine, starting with William Taft in 1909. All 3 brands would quickly move up to 6-cylinder models as their focus, although the Pierce-Arrow 7.4-liter 453 was easily the largest, with 48 horsepower, and they would introduce their trademark flared headlight housings for 1914. Peerless would be the second company to offer electric lights and starter, and a V8, after GM and Cadillac in both cases. The same time Packard would introduce the first production V12 as its legendary Twin 6. And although most companies would make some kind of military vehicle once the U.S. entered the First World War, Austin was using Peerless chassis for British armored vehicles much earlier in the war. And after the war, all 3 had become popular choices among celebrities and royalty worldwide, while most brands struggled in the post-war recession. But from a sales perspective, Packard was the clear leader, bumping Cadillac from the top sales slot in the luxury segment in 1920, and holding on to it for most of the next 3 decades. And although Packard was sometimes referred to as the American Rolls-Royce, it was the Pierce-Arrow that was often seen as the most posh of the 3, and it continued on as the preferred presidential vehicle, in spite of retaining its 4-valve straight 6. Yet the 3 brands would still be compared in the global media into the 1930s. But even before the Depression, company outlooks would be changing. Peerless was the sportiest of the 3, in fact competing more directly with the likes of Stutz and Marmon by this time, but already struggling financially, and a V16 model of 1931 would be the last of the line. The Pierce-Arrow was quickly looking dated, and would be taken over by Studebaker in 1928, which expanded their dealer network, and in 1929 allowed them to finally upgrade to an 8-cylinder engine. So their outlook became quite promising before the market crash. In fact, seeing some of its best-selling years ever, and still looking strong in 1930, prompting a level of confidence that was perhaps unhealthy. And the cars moved even further up market as sales began to decline, introducing a new V12 for 1932. But by 1933, Studebaker was bankrupt, the company president had committed suicide, and Pierce-Arrow was sold off. Prior to this, Pierce had introduced what some might consider to be the first dream machine, a prototype streamlined show car described as the Pierce-Arrow of 1940 and called the Silver Arrow, and 5 slightly less radical versions of it would be produced for sale in 1933 in an attempt to salvage the company's image. But the more conventional models would continue on, with 8 and 12-cylinder engines, refusing to move down market, and a tasteful restyle for 1936 failed to improve things. An attempt was made to refinance and restructure in 1937, but it failed to go through, and production ended in 1938 after just a few dozen cars were made. So one could argue that made Packard the winner, not only surviving the Great Depression, but remaining a sales leader in the luxury segment into the early 1950s. Practically a miracle for an independent brand during the period, let alone a luxury brand. But it achieved that by moving down market. Not at first, however, as it too ignored the issue to begin with. Packard had settled into strictly making straight 8s by the late 1920s, but introduced a new twin-six for 1932, selling for a whopping $3,800 and losing millions for the year, prompting a modernization of production with the intent of improving efficiency. The result is what saved the company, the Model 120 of 1935. Starting at $1,000, it was half the price of the next cheapest Packard, the Light 8, increasing both sales and profits. And in 1937, it would be joined by an even cheaper, but less successful, 6, later called the 110, doing damage to Packard's prestige reputation, damage that Packard never really recovered from, causing the brand to struggle to find its place after the war. And in 1950, it would be dethroned by Cadillac as far as sales. Then they purchased Studebaker in 1954, which actually created a huge financial issue, meaning that by 1957, Packards were just fancy Studebakers, often referred to as Packard Bakers, and the brand was phased out after 1958, putting an end to the last of the 3 Ps. These days, some people debate if the 3 Ps was actually even a thing, as most of the original media references have been lost or forgotten. But fans and collectors keep it alive, as a part of what many consider to be the golden age of the automobile. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.